Cherokee are the only surviving representative of the southern Iroquoian peoples. The split between the ancestral Cherokee and the northern Iroquoian occurring about 3,500 to 4,000 years ago. The Iroquoian languages appear to have broken up within the last 1,000 to 1,500 years. The word Cherokee is foreign to the language of the people known commonly by that name, their self-designation coming from a word meaning real people or principal people. The native term is Yanwea or Ani Yanwea, or the native term Kitua, as told by John Ross, Cherokee chief. The Cherokee population for the 1600s has been estimated at about 22,000, about 30,000 by the late 17th century and 18th century. However, smallpox epidemics devastated the Cherokee. It was introduced like germ warfare by settlers through giving them blankets. Especially the 1738-1739 outbreak, which halved their numbers. The disfigurement caused by smallpox led some Cherokee to suicide. From the 1760s to the early 1780s, the Cherokees were almost constantly at war on their own land with European colonists. By 1782, they were on the verge of extinction, only to be hit by germ warfare again, smallpox, in 1783. Numbering little more than 13,000 by the early 19th century, their numbers rose again to about 22,000 by 1835. By this time, Cherokee lands, at one time immense, had shrunk to an area framed by the approximate coincidence of the states of North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama. After the 1812 war, most of the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creeks, and Chickasaws were still living in their homelands and intended to remain there. The tribal leaders, however, were convinced that their people's survival depended on their ability to adopt the white man's ways. In 1820, literacy grew rapidly, and in 1828 a newspaper called the Cherokee Phoenix was published at the Cherokee capital of New Echota. Notably, the establishment of the Phoenix was owed much to the missionary Reverend Samuel Worcester. In the same year, the Cherokee established a political system based on that of the American Republic. The Cherokee at this time owned 15 million acres of land and were rich in livestock and slaves. Many spoke fluent English, while their educational, judicial, and legislative systems were often praised. Nevertheless, in 1829, gold was discovered on Cherokee land, and Cherokees were increasingly subjected to armed invasions by Georgians, forcibly seizing horses and cattle, taking possession of houses from which they had ejected the occupants, and assaulting the owners who dared to make resistance. On May 28, 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which set aside land west of the river Mississippi for the reception of such tribes as may choose to exchange the lands where they now reside and remove there. In the same year, the Cherokee established a political system based on that of the American Republic. The Cherokee at this time owned 15 million acres of land and were rich in livestock and slaves. Many spoke fluent English, while their educational, judicial, and legislative systems were often praised. Nevertheless, in 1829, gold was discovered on Cherokee land, and Cherokees were increasingly subjected to armed invasions by Georgians, forcibly seizing horses and cattle, taking possession of houses from which they had ejected the occupants, and assaulting the owners who dared to make resistance. On May 28, 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which set aside land west of the river Mississippi for the reception of such tribes as may choose to exchange the lands where they now reside and remove there. This act applied to all tribes east of the Mississippi River. According to President Jackson's annual message to Congress for December 7, 1835, all tribes to the east of the Mississippi with the exception of two small bands living in Ohio and Indiana, not exceeding 1,500 persons, and of the Cherokees have entered into engagements which will lead to their transplantation. In practice, despite the act's suggestion of choice, removal was forced upon the Indian people.
I had known Sam Houston, Colina, the Raven, when I was a girl, when the Cherokee lived in Tennessee. His father was dead, and he spent much time with our people. Chief John Jolly made the Raven his son. The Raven had been our champion over many years, many times against the hatred of the whites. He spoke for us to the great and powerful Andrew Jackson. My father was a white man. My mother's father was white. But I am John Jolly's cousin, and I am a Cherokee. The Cherokee came from Tennessee to these lands along the Arkansas to escape the whites. The Raven had helped convince us to sell our homes and move west peacefully before we were killed or driven out for the gold in our hills. We have tried to become like the white man. We have taken up his language, his religion, his way of life, more than any other tribe. We have taken in more whites. We even hold slaves like the whites. And for these things, we are resented.
The usual justification for this was expressed by President Jackson in the above annual message: Indians cannot live in contact with civilized community and prosper. If Indians remained in contact with civilization, their extinction was supposed to be inevitable. Removal of the Indians was therefore a moral duty. In Worcester versus Georgia case of 1839, the Supreme Court under Chief Justice John Marshall determined that within their boundary they, the Cherokee, possessed rights with which no state could interfere. Georgia, however, with President Jackson's encouragement, chose to ignore the court's findings, and in 1833, Georgia held a lottery of Cherokee land and property, again leading to the eviction of Cherokees from their homes and stealing of their livestock. In 1835, Reverend John Schermerhorn was appointed U.S. Commissioner to the Cherokee. By this time, the Cherokee were divided into the Ross and Ridge factions, anti- and pro-removal, respectively. Schermerhorn signed a removal treaty with the Ridge faction at New Echota on December 29, 1835, ceding all Cherokee land east of the Mississippi to the government in return for $5 million. For the Ridge Party, acceding to removal was the only way of preserving the Cherokee Nation from death. But the sale of Cherokee land carried a death penalty. In 1839, Major Ridge, his son, his nephew Elias Boudinot, was assassinated for signing the New Echota Treaty.
And so, to fulfill all obligations and in full payment for Tennessee lands surrendered by the Cherokee, the President of the United States, at the direction of the Congress, does offer these remunerations to the value of $50,000, redeemable by the Department of the Treasury at such...
Show me the gold.
At such time as is deemed appropriate and such monies are deemed available.
We want to see the gold.
By the Secretary of the Treasury and authorized by...
Show us the gold!
Open the strongbox, Sergeant.
Where's the gold? Cherokee were promised gold for their land. Where is it?
Now, the Army is only an instrument of policy, Mr. Houston. This script was authorized by the Congress. It's all there is.
Worthless paper for half the land in Tennessee. By God, sir, I'd have these men kill you.
Now, Houston, the bill authorizing such payment was signed by President Jackson himself.
The payment of worthless scrip for the Tennessee lands awoke the Raven from his slumber. He vowed to go to Washington and plead the cause of the Cherokee.
Cherokee, then under John Ross, contested the validity of the treaty, as did some of their white supporters, to no avail. The Cherokee were given 2 years from the ratification of the treaty on May 18, 1836, to leave their lands for Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. In 1838, Cherokee were rounded up by troops with rifle and bayonet and placed in stockades where hundreds died. Following on the heels of the troops, a lawless rabble made systematic hunts for Indian graves to rob them of the silver pendants and other valuables deposited with the dead. From Mooney's account quoted in Thornton, 1987, page 116, Thornton states that Mooney's estimate of 4,000 deaths as direct result of the removal is probably far short of the true figure, which he believes may have been over 8,000. In 1837, President Jackson explained the benefits of removal. The states which had so long been retarded in their improvement by the Indian tribes residing in the midst of them are at length relieved from the evil. The safety and comfort of our own citizens have been greatly promoted by their removal. During the Civil War, 1860 through 1865, the Cherokee were again divided, and whilst formerly siding with the Confederacy, factions fought in both Confederate and Union armies. Cherokee homes were raided not only by these two armies, but by opposing Cherokee parties. Cherokees were driven from their homes, schools, and houses were burned, and orchards destroyed along with churches and public buildings. Mooney claimed that the war reduced Cherokee numbers from 21,000 to 14,000. The General Allotment or Dawes Act, passed in 1887, authorized the government to divide up Indian land into discrete units to be distributed among individual Indian families, whether they agreed with the arrangement or not. Surplus Indian land that remained after its distribution was offered to white settlers. At this time, however, the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw Creek, and Chickasaw, and Seminole, were exempt from the Act's provisions. But this changed with the passing of the Curtis Act in 1898. The 5 nations' lands were now to be allotted as above, and tribal governments were to be dissolved on March 4, 1906. Though they functioned until Oklahoma became a state in 1907, at this time Indian Territory ceased to exist. In 1900, ever-growing majority of Cherokee attended Christian churches, but sermons were in Cherokee. By 1913, there were 10 churches on the Qualak Boundary Reservation in North Carolina, all but 2 with Indian preachers preaching in their native tongue. Council meetings always open with a Christian prayer. On April 6th through the 7th, 1984, at Red Clay, Tennessee, for the first time since 1837, the Eastern and Western Cherokee met in council to discuss mutual concerns about health, education, legislation, economics, and cultural preservation, and to affirm their brotherhood. This meeting was also the first of its kind since the Trail of Tears in 1838, which divided the Cherokee into what became the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and the Eastern Band of the North Carolina. Among the resolutions passed by the council was a demand for the return of skeletal remains exhumed from archaeological sites during the 1988 and 1989. In a further show of brotherhood, Cherokees all over America remembered the Trail of Tears. This act of remembrance continues with the annual Trail of Tears sings, hosted by the Snowbird Cherokee in Graham County, North Carolina. The Eastern Band affirmed their own identity as a unique tribe with distinctive history. According to anthropologist Dwayne King, the Eastern Band have retained more of their myths, legend, and traditional dances, though modified in form, than the Western Cherokee, although in both groups the native language is fast disappearing. Some progressive are, however, resigned to the passing away of the old traditions. In 1988, Chief Youngdeer said, "We hate to lose them, but the old ways don't put bread on the table." Nevertheless, kinship and tribal identity, whilst not easily defined, continues to be important, and according to Finger, the Cherokee wish to retain their land base while moving toward greater self-sufficiency. It is said that following the Trail of Tears in 1838, the elders of the Cherokee Nation prophesied that in the 7th generation the people would be strong again. This prophecy is believed to have been fulfilled with the reunion of the Eastern and Western Cherokee at Red Clay, Tennessee in 1934. Looking Horse of the Sioux Nation and keeper of the sacred pipe also states that the healing of that nation has now begun in the 7th generation. Talking Stick Journal, Winter-Spring 1996, one significance of the number 7 is said to be renewal and return, which seen in the context of the new fire ceremony. Although still having no formal relationship with each other, the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and the Eastern Band alternate special council meetings once a year at Cherokee, Aquala Boundary Reservation Community, North Carolina, and Tahlequah, Oklahoma, the Cherokee Nation's capital. I am Pastor Thomas Williams. I'm a Native American who has become part of the fabric of the American nation. My people survived by intermarriage and blending into their surroundings. By evolving into a new species, I have survived. I have not gone the route of the dinosaurs and other extinct species. You might think that such suffering and evil upon my people would make me to be bitter and hold a grudge. Well, I'm too intelligent to fall for such weakness, because I know that it was evil men who loved money and power more than the God they claimed to follow that did this evil. The same evil men that are destroying our nation today, men with hearts like Hitler and other tyrants of history, men who set themselves above their Creator and are not their brother's keeper. Like Cain, they are marked for their murderous hearts, for killing innocent babies by abortion, and the sick and weak with euthanasia. They are perverse and seek to change the laws of nature set by the Creator of the universe. Yes, these same evil men who marched my people through the snow in the dead of winter are alive and well today. That same spirit that watched my people die by the thousands of starvation and exposure will also do the same to you. You, as a Christian, are in their way. Just like the Cherokee and other Indian nations, you stand in their way to one world power, to one sex, and peace by socialistic slavery. They will remove you any way they can by ruining you financially, by making it impossible for you to live, just like they did the Indians. When you are so weak from hunger and despair, you will do whatever they say and go where they tell you to go. They will divide your people with propaganda and lies and turn you against each other so you cannot agree and have power in numbers. Yes, history repeats itself. According to Solomon in the Bible, he said that it would. The world turns around and history meets itself again in the process. Man's too ignorant to learn from history and see it coming again as it has before. No, he, like an ostrich, sticks his head in the ground, thinking he is hidden from the danger. Are you ready to walk your trail of tears? Are you ready for another Holocaust? Right now, this nation is being taken over by people who hate God, and in order to remove Him completely, they will have to remove all traces of Him, including Christians. And they're willing to do that any way they can. Wake up, Christians. You're sleeping.